CEO Ethan Blake fell in love with a poor girl who had nothing, but she wasn't who he thought she was, and the truth about her could destroy everything he believed about love, power, and his own name. He was a man who owned skyscrapers, controlled billion-dollar deals, and trusted only verified facts, but she appeared in his world with no past, no records, and no fear, just quiet strength, and eyes that seemed to recognize him long before he knew her. She was poor, or at least she lived like she had nothing, but the way she spoke, the way she saw things others missed, the way she looked at him, she understood something deeper. It didn't add up. And still, the CEO who never believed in love found himself drawn to her, choosing her, trusting her. But every answer she gave only raised more questions. Every step closer to her pulled him deeper into something he couldn't control. Who was this poor girl the CEO had fallen in love with? And why did it feel like she had been waiting for him all along? Ethan Blake didn't believe in surprises, not after a childhood shaped by power without warmth, where he learned early that control was the only thing that kept life from falling apart. And now at 36, as the formidable CEO of Blake Industries, a company that dominated skylines, controlled billion-dollar projects, and quietly decided the fate of cities, he lived by precision, by structure, by certainty, which was exactly why the brief report that morning unsettled him. Minor structural concern. Under control. There was no such thing as minor, not in his world, and certainly not in a company that carried his name. So against his usual routine, he arrived unannounced at one of his largest construction sites, his presence instantly shifting the atmosphere as workers straightened, supervisors grew tense, and the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Because Ethan Blake was not a man who came to observe, he came to find flaws. Who signed off on this section? He asked, his voice calm but heavy with authority, and the site supervisor hurried forward. All ready and easy. Everything is stable, sir. We've double-checked. You assumed. Ethan cut in, his eyes scanning the steel framework with quiet intensity, catching the smallest inconsistencies, the way he always did, the way he had trained himself to do after years of learning that the smallest overlooked detail could lead to the biggest collapse. And just as the supervisor struggled to recover, a voice interrupted, clear, steady, and completely unafraid. You didn't double-check. You skipped reinforcement on the load-bearing joint. The words sliced through the tension, drawing every eye toward the speaker. And Ethan turned to see her for the first time. A young woman standing with an unusual stillness, her clothes simple, her presence almost invisible in a place like this, yet her eyes carried a quiet certainty that didn't belong to someone of her apparent status. And the supervisor scoffed defensively. And who are you to that beam? She continued without raising her voice, pointing with precise focus. Is taking an even pressure. The world was rushed. It's already showing stress fractures. And for a brief moment, Ethan followed her gaze and saw it, a faint line, nearly invisible, but real, and something in him tightened because she was right. Check it, he ordered immediately. And though the supervisor hesitated, the command in Ethan's tone left no room for refusal. A worker climbed up, examined the joint, and then his voice echoed down with unmistakable uncertainty. Sir, she's right. Murmurs spread across the site, the supervisor's confidence collapsing faster than the structure itself. And Ethan's attention returned to the girl. Your name, he said, watching closely as she paused just for a second, just enough to matter before answering. Maya Lane, the hesitation registering quietly in his mind, the kind that suggested choice rather than memory. Where did you learn structural analysis? He asked, and she shrugged lightly. You pick things up when you have to vague, to controlled, like someone used to hiding more than she revealed. And before he could press further, a deep metallic groan cut through the air, sharp and wrong. Every instinct in Ethan firing at once, as all eyes lifted to the beam she had pointed at, which shifted, cracked, and then gave way in a violent collapse that sent dust exploding outward, and workers shouting in panic, "Evacuate! Now!" Ethan commanded instantly, his voice cutting through chaos as people scattered and alarms of fear echoed across the site. But in the middle of it all, he saw something that didn't fit. Maya wasn't running away. She was moving toward the collapse, fast, focused, as if drawn by something stronger than fear. "Stop, it's not safe," he called, but she didn't even look back, and for a brief, unsettling moment, something unfamiliar stirred in him, not fear, but recognition. Like he had seen that kind of urgency before in a memory he rarely allowed himself to revisit. And through the thick dust and rising cries for help, she dropped to her knees beside the debris, listening intently before saying with quiet certainty, "There's someone under here." And Ethan froze for a fraction of a second, because she didn't guess she knew. And as he moved closer, signaling others to assist, his eyes remained fixed on her, on the precision of her movements, the calm in her urgency, the way she handled chaos like someone who had lived through it before. And in that moment, a thought formed. Quiet but impossible to ignore. This poor girl was not just someone who noticed danger. She was someone who had survived it. Ethan didn't leave the site immediately after the collapse, even after the injured had been taken away and the dust began to settle into a dull, uneasy silence, because something about what had just happened refused to settle inside him. And more than the structural failure, more than the supervisor's negligence, it was the girl Maya Lane who remained fixed in his mind like a question he couldn't ignore. He stood at a distance, watching her as she moved quietly among the workers, checking on the injured, offering water, speaking in calm, steady tones that seemed to ground people far more than the loud commands echoing across the site. And it struck him again that she didn't behave like someone who had just witnessed a disaster, and she behaved like someone who understood it. "You handled that well," Ethan said when he finally approached her, his voice controlled, observant, and she turned to him without surprise, as if she had already sensed he would come. "Someone had to," she replied simply, brushing dust from her hands, her composure almost unsettling. Ethan studied her closely, noticing how her eyes moved not randomly, but with purpose, scanning structures, exits, people, as though her mind was constantly mapping risk. "You knew that beam would fail," he said, not as a question, but as a fact. And for a brief second something flickered in her expression, something deeper than confidence, memory, but it vanished just as quickly. "It was obvious," she said, though they both knew it wasn't. He folded his arms slightly. "Not to trained engineers," he countered, watching 4 cracks in her response, and she gave a faint shrug. "Maybe they weren't looking properly," she said, deflecting, but the calmness in her tone felt practiced, like someone who had learned how to hide knowledge rather than reveal it. He shifted slightly closer, lowering his voice. "And the trapped worker, you didn't guess, you knew where he was." And this time she paused longer, her gaze drifting briefly toward the collapsed section, where a faint echo of sound, metal tearing, voices shouting seemed to replay in her mind. And for a split second, she wasn't here anymore. She was somewhere else, in another collapse, another moment where everything had gone wrong. But she forced herself back. "You listen," she said quietly. "People make noise when they're scared." The answer was simple, but it carried a weight that came from experience, not theory. Ethan noticed the subtle tightening of her fingers, the way she exhaled slowly after speaking, small signs that she was holding something in, and it only deepened his curiosity. "What exactly do you do here?" he asked, and she glanced around before answering. "Whatever is needed, cleaning, lifting, helping," her voice neutral, but something about the way she said it suggested she was used to being underestimated, and perhaps preferred it that way. Ethan made a decision then, quick and firm, the way he always did when something felt strategically important. "You won't be doing that anymore," he said, and she frowned slightly, a hint of resistance surfacing. "I didn't ask for anything," she replied, her tone not rude, but guarded, as if independence was something she protected fiercely. "This isn't charity," he said calmly. "It's an adjustment. You'll assist the safety team. Temporary," he added deliberately, and she hesitated, her mind moving through possibilities, risks, exposure. because stepping closer to him meant stepping closer to something she had spent years avoiding, and a faint memory surfaced again: documents, warnings ignored, a voice telling her to stay quiet, but she pushed it down. "I don't have qualifications," she said, testing him, and Ethan held her gaze. "You saw what others didn't, that's enough," he replied. And something in his certainty made it difficult to refuse, not because of authority, but because he genuinely meant it. She studied him for a moment, as if trying to understand why he was doing this, and finally asked softly, "Why?" And Ethan paused, just briefly, before answering, "Because I don't ignore value," though even as he said it, something deeper lingered beneath that reason, something he hadn't fully named yet. Maya looked away, her expression tightening slightly, as if accepting meant stepping into something irreversible, but after a moment, she nodded. "Fine. Temporary." And the word carried a quiet boundary. Ethan gave a slight nod and turned to leave, but as he walked away, he felt it, that unfamiliar pull of curiosity tightening its grip, because for the first time in a long time, something in his world didn't fit neatly into logic. And the more he tried to understand her, the more it felt like he was stepping into a story that had already begun long before he arrived. Ethan told himself it was a rational decision, nothing more, just another calculated adjustment to prevent future failures. Yet over the next few days, he found his attention returning to Maya more often than it should, noticing the way she moved through the site with quiet awareness, how she observed before she acted, how she spoke only when necessary, but always with unsettling accuracy. And it didn't take long for the engineers, some older, more experienced, and far more qualified on paper, to begin relying on her input, even if reluctantly at first. "You're saying the load distribution here is uneven?" one of them asked, pointing at a complex diagram, and Maya, wheeled closer, her eyes scanning it with a familiarity she ever explained. "Not uneven yet, but it will be if you keep the current alignment," she said calmly, picking up a pencil and marking a small adjustment that seemed insignificant but shifted the entire structure's balance. And the engineer frowned, skeptical, until a quick recalculation proved her right. And Ethan, standing just outside the glass-walled office, watched it all unfold with growing interest, because this wasn't guesswork, this was trained precision. Later that afternoon, he called her into a quieter section of the site, away from the noise. "You've done this before," he said without preamble, and she shook her head almost immediately. No, too quickly, and he noticed it. The same way he noticed inconsistencies in contracts and data sheets. "Then where does this come from?" he pressed, his voice steady but probing. And for a moment she said nothing, her gaze shifting past him, not avoiding him, but looking through him, as if she was seeing something else entirely, a memory buried beneath layers of silence. In that brief pause, a flicker of her past surfaced again, clearer this time, the echo of a lecture hall. Blueprints spread across a desk, a voice guiding her through calculations, always read beyond the surface. "Amelia, structures fail where people stop looking." The voice warm, firm, gone too soon, and just as quickly as it appeared. She pushed it away, returning to the present. "I just pay attention," she said finally, but the answer felt thinner than before, like it was starting to crack under pressure. Ethan studied her closely, then shifted the direction slightly. "You avoid the main office," he said, and this time her reaction was sharper, almost instinctive. "I don't need to be there," she replied, but her tone carried something new, not just caution, but resistance. "It's part of the job," he said calmly. "You'll need access to full reports." And for a second, something unspoken passed through her expression, fear, controlled but real, the kind that didn't belong to someone simply uncomfortable with corporate spaces. And Ethan noticed, filing it away without comment, because pushing too hard now might make her retreat completely. Instead, he changed approach. "Come tomorrow," he added, softer, more like a suggestion than an order. And she hesitated again, that internal calculation returning, weighing risk against necessity, because stepping into that building meant stepping closer to something she had spent years staying away from, something tied to the name Blake Industries in ways he didn't yet understand. And somewhere deep inside, another memory stirred sirens, shattered concrete, a hand slipping from hers, voices promising investigations that never came, and she exhaled slowly, grounding herself before nodding. "All right," she said quietly, though the word felt heavier than it should. That evening, as Ethan sat in his office high above the city, surrounded by glass walls that reflected the life he had built, controlled, structured, untouchable, he found himself looking at her file again. Or rather, the lack of one, because everything about Maya Lane began only a few years ago. Clean, minimal, almost deliberately incomplete, and in his world, nothing incomplete stayed unexplained for long. He leaned back slightly, his mind connecting details the way it always did: her knowledge, her restraint, her reactions, the way she seemed to recognize danger before it fully formed. And for the first time, a thought surfaced that didn't feel entirely comfortable, not because it was illogical, but because it suggested something deeper than he was used to dealing with. Maya Lane wasn't just hiding her past, she was protecting it. And the question that followed lingered quietly in the room after the city lights dimmed. What kind of past required that level of silence? Maya arrived at Blake Industries the next morning earlier than necessary, standing across the street for a long moment before stepping forward, her eyes fixed on the towering glass building that carried a name she had spent years avoiding. And for a brief second, the world around her seemed to quiet as memory pressed in the echo of sirens, the weight of dust in her lungs, a voice calling her name from somewhere she could no longer reach. But she forced it down, steadying herself before crossing the street, because turning back was no longer an option. Inside, everything felt different from the construction site: controlled, polished, cold, mirroring the man who owned it. And as she walked through the lobby, she became aware of how out of place she looked, not because of how people stared, but because of how quickly they judged, their eyes lingering just long enough to measure and dismiss. Yet she kept moving, her posture calm, her expression unreadable, as if she had learned long ago how to exist in spaces that didn't want her there. "You must be Maya," a voice said, and she turned to see Ethan's assistant, composed and efficient, offering a polite but curious smile. "Mr. Blake is expecting you." And as she followed her toward the elevators, Maya's gaze shifted briefly to the walls framed photographs of completed projects, awards, headlines celebrating innovation and growth, and then one image caught her attention, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough to tighten something deep inside her chest, because she recognized it instantly, not as a success story, but as a memory she had lived through differently, a structure that had once stood and fallen. She looked away quickly, masking the reaction, but the past had already stirred. When the elevator doors opened to the executive floor, the contrast sharpened even further: quiet hallways, controlled movement, power that didn't need to announce itself. And at the end of it all was Ethan's office, glass-walled, overlooking the city he had helped shape. And when she stepped inside, he was already there, standing by the window, his presence as composed as ever. Yet his eyes shifted to her almost immediately, assessing, observing, noting every subtle change in her demeanor. "You came," he said simply, and she nodded. "You said I should," her tone neutral, but there was a faint tension beneath it, something he didn't miss. He gestured toward the table, where several documents were spread out. "These are project reports. I want your input." And as she stepped closer, her hesitation returned, not obvious, but there, in the slight pause before she reached for the papers, because this was no longer just observation, this was involvement, and involvement meant exposure. Still, she forced herself forward, picking up the first document, her eyes scanning it quickly, and within seconds, the familiar shift happened. The environment faded, the structure of the report unfolding in her mind the way it always had, patterns forming, flaws revealing themselves, and without thinking, she spoke. "This section was rushed," she said, pointing to a detail most would overlook. "The timeline doesn't match the material stress levels." And Ethan watched closely, because this was what intrigued him most: not just that she was right, but how naturally it came to her, as if this world, despite her resistance to it, was one she already understood deeply. "You've seen reports like this before," he said, and she stilled slightly, her fingers tightening around the paper before she set it down. "No," she replied, but this time the denial felt thinner, more fragile, and he noticed, before he could push further, a voice from the open doorway interrupted. "Ethan, the board is asking." The man stopped mid-sentence when he saw Maya, his expression shifting instantly from professional to stunned, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if trying to place something he couldn't fully grasp. And the silence that followed was brief but heavy. "Do I know you?" the man asked slowly, and for the first time since she had entered the building, Maya's composure cracked just slightly, just enough for Ethan to see the flash of something real beneath it. Something like recognition, or fear. She shook her head quickly. "No," her voice calm but firmer now, controlled. And Ethan's gaze shifted between them, the air in the room tightening with unspoken questions. Because the reaction hadn't been random, it had been triggered. The man frowned slightly, still uncertain. "You just look familiar," he added. But Maya had already stepped back slightly, creating distance, as if instinctively protecting herself from something she didn't want to surface. And Ethan, watching it all unfold, felt that quiet sense of certainty deepen inside him, the one that had been building since the moment he met her. Because this wasn't coincidence, this was connection, one that reached further back than she was willing to admit. As the man left, the room fell into a quieter tension, and Ethan finally spoke, his voice lower now, more deliberate. "You've been here before." And this time, she didn't answer immediately, her eyes drifting once more to the city beyond the glass, where past and present seemed to blur for a fleeting second. And when she finally spoke, her words were simple, but they carried a weight he couldn't yet fully understand. "Not like this," she said. Ethan found himself watching Maya more closely than he cared to admit, noticing the way she moved through the office floor with quiet precision, how her eyes lingered on details most people ignored, how she carried herself with an ease that contrasted sharply with the sterile luxury around her, and it unsettled him in a way he hadn't experienced in years. He realized he was no longer just observing her for professional insight, he was observing her because every action, every hesitation, seemed loaded with unspoken history. That morning, he invited her to lunch in the executive cafeteria, a neutral space where most employees didn't linger, and she arrived punctually, her expression neutral but alert, scanning the room as if each table could hide a story. "I didn't know the cafeteria was this quiet," she said lightly, settling across from him, and he noticed how her fingers brushed against the edge of the table, almost unconsciously, a minor gesture that hinted at years of learned caution. "It usually isn't," he replied, watching her carefully. "You just notice things others don't." She smiled faintly, almost ironically. "Maybe I have too." The words, casual on the surface, hinted at an entire life spent navigating spaces where she wasn't meant to be, where survival meant reading people and situations in a heartbeat. As they ate, Ethan began probing lightly, his questions professional but layered. "When did you start helping at sites like that?" She paused, almost imperceptibly, glancing at the window as sunlight caught a scar near her wrist, a scar she hadn't noticed. He was observing. "I picked up work wherever I could," she said, and the vagueness didn't escape him. He noticed the subtle tightening of her shoulders, the slight narrowing of her eyes, signs of internal calculation, and he decided to test the waters further. "And yet you noticed the beam before anyone else did. That takes experience." She looked down at her plate, tracing a pattern with her fork, and for a brief moment, the cafeteria noise faded, replaced by a silent flashback, her father in a dimly lit workshop, guiding her hands over blueprints, showing her where materials would fail, teaching her not just to read numbers, but people. "Always predict where the cracks will appear first," he had said, and the memory left a faint tremor in her chest. Ethan watched her, noting the micro-expression that betrayed her, and leaned forward slightly. "That knowledge doesn't come from nowhere." She met his gaze for the first time, a long stretch, her eyes holding a mixture of wariness and something like respect. "It comes from learning to survive," she said softly. For the first time, the space between them felt charged. It wasn't just professional curiosity. There was tension, subtle but undeniable. A micro cliffhanger formed. Why did she know so much, yet act like a poor girl with no formal training? And why, despite her guarded nature, did she now allow him this close, even in casual conversation? Ethan sensed the first real bond forming, built not on attraction, but recognition of competence, intelligence, and a strange, unspoken history. But underneath it, something dangerous lurked, secrets she wasn't ready to reveal, yet which were already threading into the fabric of their connection. As lunch ended, and they walked back toward the office space, Ethan's hand brushed briefly against hers when she stumbled over a step. She froze, looked at him sharply, then away, her pulse quickening slightly. It was subtle, but he caught it, the first real crack in her stoic exterior. The unspoken question hovered. Could she truly remain the poor girl he thought he understood, or was there a deeper story ready to emerge? One that could change everything he thought he knew. The evening air in the city felt heavier than usual as Maya walked back to the small apartment she had rented months ago. The streets quiet now, the neon signs flickering in rhythm with the distant hum of traffic, and for the first time that day, she allowed herself to exhale fully. Though the calm was only temporary, the encounter in the cafeteria replayed in her mind the way Ethan's gaze had lingered, the subtle brush of his hand, the questions that hadn't been answered, questions about her knowledge, her past, her instincts, and she knew instinctively that things were beginning to shift, that being under his observation wasn't just professional anymore. She reached her apartment building and paused outside the door, leaning lightly against the cool metal frame, and her mind drifted back to a childhood defined by quiet survival, the smell of old books and concrete workshops, her father's instructions echoing in her ears. Notice the unseen, predict the unseen, trust only what you can control, and the faint memory of her mother's hand, warm and gentle, telling her that some secrets were meant to protect, not deceive. Inside, she set her bag down and moved to the small kitchen, unpacking a few items, her movements deliberate but mechanical, almost meditative, and yet even in this privacy, she felt the pull of the day, the scrutiny, the observation, the questions, and a small shiver ran through her, not from cold, but anticipation. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced at the screen. A message from Ethan, short, professional, almost clipped, yet it carried the same undercurrent she had felt all day. Review the site plans. I'll see you tomorrow, Blake. She stared at the message, thumb hovering over the screen, a tension building in her chest, because responding or not responding was already a choice that mattered. Her mind drifted again, involuntarily, to an incident she had buried, a construction site years ago, a beam giving way, workers trapped, chaos and dust, and someone stepping forward to guide people safely through it. A memory of courage, of instinct, of knowledge that had been honed by necessity, yet unrecognized formally. A second, sharper memory cut through that one. The day a corporate inspection team had come, asking questions about her background, about documents she didn't have, about a family name that had vanished from records, but one that still existed in fragments, in whispers, in files she had burned and hidden. Her pulse quickened. The sound of a faint knock on the door pulled her back to the present. Her heart skipped, and she checked the peephole. No one. But something felt off, an inkling, a shadow of someone noticing her movements, of a life she thought was private starting to intersect with the world she was now entering. She stepped back, uneasy, her training in reading people and situations screaming that danger didn't always announce itself, and that sometimes the past came knocking in silent ways. She sank into the chair near the window, looking at the city skyline that Ethan now occupied, thinking of him not just as a man in control of a corporate empire, but as a man whose curiosity, his piercing, relentless curiosity, could pierce the careful armor she had built for herself. And for the first time, she realized the stakes were higher than she had allowed herself to admit. The closer she moved to him, the closer she moved to exposure, and the secrets she had carried, the very identity she had concealed as Maya Lane, were threads dangerously fraying under the pressure of proximity, observation, and an unspoken emotional pull she wasn't ready to confront. Somewhere deep in the back of her mind, a quiet warning whispered, "You've survived this long by being invisible, by being unknown, but he will find out, eventually." The following morning, Ethan's office felt unusually tense as he waited for Maya to arrive, reviewing reports with meticulous attention, finding his mind repeatedly drifting to her, how she had moved through the corporate space, how she had noticed things no one else did, how she carried herself with an authority that didn't match the poor girl persona she claimed. When she finally stepped into the office, the door closing softly behind her, he observed her closely, the faint tremor in her hand as she adjusted the strap of her bag, the subtle hesitation before she spoke, the way her eyes flicked over the documents as if they carried more than they revealed. "Morning," she said quietly, voice even but distant, as if she had spent the entire night reviewing risks, scanning for errors, anticipating the questions that might come. And Ethan noticed that tension immediately, a signal he had learned to trust. "Good morning," he replied, motioning toward the reports laid out on the table. "I want to start with last night's revisions. You noticed the material discrepancies yesterday, explain them to me." She leaned over the table, tracing the lines with her fingers. The supplier specs were off by 2.3%. On paper, negligible, but in structural stress, it could cascade across the supports. He listened silently, noting the precision, the confidence, and the subtle pause when she didn't immediately name the source. He had seen this hesitation before in executives hiding corporate oversights, but she was not an executive. "Where did you learn to measure like this?" he asked, keeping his voice calm, almost conversational, though the question carried weight. She paused, eyes flicking toward the window as if measuring escape routes, her mind shifting rapidly through safe answers. "I paid attention," she said finally. The words clipped, controlled, yet something in her posture betrayed her, a slight stiffening of her shoulders, the faint furrow of her brow, the quick glance to a corner of the office where he had placed a blueprint of an old project, and Ethan caught it. For the first time, the cracks in her story became visible. A small, but significant slip. She recognized something she shouldn't have, something from before the life she claimed to have started recently. The files, the projects, the structures, they weren't just familiar, they were part of a past carefully buried. He remembered the subtle flash he had noticed in her eyes in the cafeteria, the micro-reaction to someone from the board, and suddenly the pieces began forming a pattern he couldn't ignore. Maya Lane was not who she said she was. "Tell me about the Northfield collapse," he said softly, casually, as if testing a theory. Her entire posture shifted, like a dancer anticipating a misstep. Her hand tightened on the edge of the table. Her gaze dropped, then darted briefly to him, searching, assessing, calculating. "I wasn't involved," she said quickly, but the hesitation was unmistakable. He leaned back, studying her, the first knot of suspicion forming. "You've seen more than you're letting on," he said, voice calm but deliberate. She met his gaze, a shadow crossing her face, a mix of fear and defiance. "I survive by being unseen," she murmured. The unspoken tension hung between them, thick as the city air outside the glass walls. Ethan now knew he had Gertrude in front of him, the girl he had started to trust and rely on, and the hidden identity she fought to conceal. And the bigger question was now unavoidable. How far was she willing to go to protect the secrets of her past? And how far would he go to uncover them? The office was unusually quiet that evening, the sun slipping behind the skyline and casting long, golden shadows across the glass walls, and Ethan remained at his desk, documents forgotten, waiting for Maya. When she arrived, her entrance was measured, cautious, each step precise, yet her eyes betrayed the tension, her fingers brushing nervously against her bag strap, posture tight, gaze flicking to the corner where the Northfield blueprints lay. He didn't greet her, simply gesturing toward the chair opposite him, and she sank into it slowly, as if bracing herself for what was coming. "Why did you lie to me?" Ethan's voice was low, controlled, but each word struck like a hammer. Maya froze, a subtle but noticeable flicker across her face. "I didn't lie," she said at first, but even as she spoke, her voice wavered, betraying the carefully constructed facade. Ethan leaned forward, the city reflected in his eyes. "You said you learned on the job. That's not true. You knew the Northfield structures, the stress reports, the supplier discrepancies. That knowledge isn't something a self-taught worker picks up in months." Her hands clenched, fingers tightening around the edge of the table as memory surged to her father's workshop. The night the collapse happened, the frantic orders, the screams, the decisions that had saved lives and condemned others, all while keeping herself hidden. "I survived," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I had to be invisible. If anyone knew who I was, what I'd seen, I wouldn't have lasted." Ethan's expression softened slightly, though suspicion lingered. "Invisible," he repeated. "And yet you came here, into my world, knowing it would expose you." Her gaze dropped, tracing a pattern on the polished tabletop, a silent confession. "I didn't come for you. I came because I had no choice. The work, it matters. I can't ignore it, even if it means being seen." The tension shifted subtly, layering guilt, pride, and vulnerability. Ethan could see it now. The woman he had begun to trust was not just skilled and intelligent, but carrying a weight of history that made her cautious, calculating, and afraid. He leaned back, letting the pause hang, then asked carefully, "And yet, you let me see some of it. You let me rely on you." She looked up, eyes glimmering. "Because I don't know you. I didn't think I could trust you. But now, I think, I can't avoid you either." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. A quiet, charged moment passed. The office, the city outside, even the sunlight seemed to hold its breath. Ethan realized that the professional tension had shifted into something more dangerous, more intimate, a bond forged from trust, fear, and the recognition of each other's truths. Yet beneath the fragile connection, the secret she carried pulsed like a hidden heartbeat, threatening to break the fragile trust forming between them. For a second, neither spoke, and Ethan knew the next move was critical. One wrong step, one word, and the delicate balance of curiosity, trust, and attraction could shatter. And in that silence, both understood something undeniable. Their connection was no longer just about work. It was personal, emotional, and powerlessly close to uncovering truths neither could fully control. The next morning, the city was alive with its usual chaos: honking cars, hurried pedestrians, and the low hum of construction. But inside Blake Industries, tension simmered beneath the polished surfaces. Maya arrived at the site early, her boots crunching against gravel, eyes scanning the skeletal structure rising before her. Something felt off, subtle irregularities in the scaffolding and alignment, ones she had instinctively noted, now screamed danger. Ethan followed quietly, observing from a distance, noting the way her eyes darted to the smallest imperfections, the faint crease between her brows, the way her body tensed and released like a coiled spring. "You're here early," he said, stepping closer, voice calm. "What's wrong?" She didn't respond immediately, tracing the lines of steel beams, a flash of memory crossing her mind. The Northfield collapse, dust choking the air, screams cutting through the chaos, workers pinned beneath beams that should have held, and her father shouting instructions she hadn't dared question. She shook it off, forcing focus back to the present. "This section," she said finally, pointing to a specific joint. "It won't support the upper load if the wind hits it at 45 degrees. The calculations were wrong." Ethan followed her gaze, his brow furrowing as he read her concern. And for the first time, the gravity of her expertise hit him fully, not just professional skill, but intimate, lived knowledge, the kind that only someone who had survived disasters could possess. "What happened here?" he asked cautiously, but she didn't answer right away. Her mind went back to a flashback she rarely allowed herself to revisit. A corporate inspector months after the collapse, asking questions she couldn't answer. Documents that had been destroyed, lies carefully constructed to protect a name that wasn't hers anymore. "It's complicated," she said finally, voice tight, masking fear beneath professionalism. "I've seen this before." Ethan's instinct sharpened. "Seen this before? How? You don't just survive a collapse like this without..." He stopped, realizing he was being careful not to push too hard. Her gaze met his briefly, unflinching but charged. "I know how to survive what others overlook. That's all you need to know for now." The tension between them tightened. Curiosity, fear, and fascination all collided in his chest. Suddenly, a loud snap echoed from the upper scaffolding. Maya's head snapped up, eyes narrowing. A beam shifted dangerously, and her instincts screamed. She lunged forward, catching a loose brace before it could fall, pulling it to safety just as a worker shouted in alarm. Heart racing, she straightened, chest heaving, eyes scanning Ethan quickly. This could have collapsed," she said, voice low but urgent. "We need immediate reinforcement. Now." Ethan nodded sharply, adrenaline kicking in. The urgency of the moment stripped away formalities and facades. "I trust you," he said, voice firm. "Lead it." And as they coordinated the team, moving with precision and unspoken communication, he realized something undeniable. Maya's past, her hidden knowledge, wasn't just a secret, it was a survival mechanism, honed in a life he was only beginning to glimpse. By the time the site stabilized, the adrenaline fading, Maya stepped back, wiping sweat from her brow. Ethan approached, close now, voice quieter, almost intimate. "You've saved lives today, more than anyone realizes." She glanced at him, a flicker of vulnerability flashing through her controlled exterior. "It's what I've always done," she said. But there was a pause, a hesitation that spoke volumes, as if admitting more would unravel the careful balance she had maintained for years. The day ended, but the silent understanding between them had shifted. Secrets were no longer just shadows. They were threads connecting them, pulling tighter, demanding trust, or risk exposure. And in that moment, both knew something unavoidable. The next revelation would change everything. The evening sky was painted in bruised purples and oranges as Maya returned to the office, exhaustion pressing against her like a physical weight, but she carried it with controlled precision, aware that Ethan was waiting. The moment she stepped inside, he looked up from his desk, eyes sharp, assessing, but softened by something unspoken. The events at the site had changed the dynamic, deepened the connection, and revealed threads of her past he couldn't ignore. "We need to talk," he said, voice steady, but carrying the weight of his curiosity and concern. She nodded, tension coiling in her shoulders, and followed him to the conference room, the space between them charged with anticipation and the unspoken questions of the last weeks. Ethan closed the door, leaning against the edge of the table. "I know you're hiding more than you've told me," he began, tone firm, but not accusatory. "The knowledge, the reactions today, it's beyond what someone with your story should have. Who are you, really?" Maya's chest tightened. She had rehearsed this confrontation in her mind countless times, yet the words never came easily. She looked away, tracing a pattern on the table, and for a moment, silence stretched. Then she exhaled sharply, as if releasing years of burden. "I'm not who you think I am," she said quietly. "I wasn't just a girl surviving day to day. I had a past I ran from, a family name erased, skills honed from tragedy, from things most people wouldn't survive." Ethan listened, every word a key unlocking the mystery he had sensed but couldn't confirm. "Why tell me now?" he asked, voice low. She met his gaze, vulnerability and defiance entwined. "Because if I want to work alongside you, I can't keep pretending anymore. Not after today. Not after risking lives and letting my past define my silence." She paused, a flicker of memory crossing her expression, a flashback to the collapse at Northfield. The faces of those trapped, the screams, the orders she had shouted, the lives saved and the secrets she had buried to protect herself and her identity. Ethan stepped closer, voice gentle but commanding, and the rest of it. The life you've hidden. She swallowed, tears glimmering in the corner of her eyes, a mixture of relief and fear. I was always capable, but I had to survive in shadows first. I had to choose when to be seen. And by whom? The room was heavy with emotion. The air between them was charged not just with attraction, but with recognition of the depth of her resilience, her courage, her humanity. He reached out, lightly touching her hand, a tentative bridge across the chasm of secrecy. Then I want to see you, all of you, he said, softly, the intensity of the moment palpable. She hesitated, then allowed herself to nod, the walls she had built over years trembling but not collapsing entirely. All of me, she whispered. The truth had surfaced. Her identity, her past, her survival, was no longer a shadow. And for the first time, Ethan didn't see the poor girl he thought he knew. He saw Mayelaine, the woman who had survived, endured, and now, against all odds, had captured the attention, respect, and heart of a man who held power, influence, and deep curiosity. The air between them was heavy with promise, tension, and the fragile bloom of trust. As the city lights blinked alive outside, they stood together, a new understanding forming. The past had been revealed, the present was charged, and the future unknown, unpredictable, yet compelling beckoned. The title's promise had been fulfilled. The CEO had fallen in love with a girl who was not who he thought she was. And now, together, they would navigate the truths, secrets, and possibilities that lay ahead.